The fire didn't destroy him. It revealed her. And from the ashes rose something neither of them expected. The truth. The crystal flute felt heavier than it should have been. Not because of its weight, Waterford crystal, light as silk in most hands, but because I was holding it while invisible. That's what I'd become in the 10 years since my father died. Ilara Thorne, the ghost that haunted the Thorne mansion. Not dead, not quite alive, existing in the thin spaces between the staff quarters and the grand halls belonging to neither world. Careful with that, dear, Aunt Beatrice had said to me that morning, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She'd swept past my bedroom, what used to be my father's study, without knocking. She never knocked. Julian's expecting powerful people tonight. We wouldn't want you ruining the evening with one of your episodes. An episode. That's what they called my reality now. My nightmares about the fire. My questions about the locked workshop door. My certainty that my father, Thomas Thorne, the man who'd created watches that kept perfect time while the world fell apart, would never have been careless enough to start a fire in his own workshop. I adjusted the hem of my black and white server's uniform in the mirror. At 23, I looked older. Exhaustion had a way of aging you. So did grief that no one acknowledged. The gala was already in full swing when I took my position near the glass doors leading to the veranda. The Thorne mansion glittered with the kind of artificial light that only money could buy. Chandeliers the size of cars, waitstaff outnumbering guests, champagne that cost more than I used to spend on books in a year. My cousin Kelsey moved through the crowd like she'd been born doing it, all practiced laughter and hand touches on the shoulders of men in Italian suits. She was 21 but moved through the world with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Of course she hadn't. She was Beatrice's daughter, raised to believe that the world was a stage, and she was the star. I was raised to be furniture. Ilara! My mother's voice. No, that's what I had to stop doing. Beatrice had made it abundantly clear that I should think of her as my aunt now, despite the fact that she'd been sleeping in my mother's bed for nearly a decade. Where's the champagne tower? These guests didn't come to stand around like peasants. Beatrice stood near the marble staircase with Uncle Julian, though he was no uncle at all. He was her brother, and together they'd orchestrated the most elaborate theft in modern history. Not that anyone called it that. The official story was simple, tragic, and utterly false. My father, Thomas Thorne, had been working late in his workshop the night of December 15th, 2013. A fire had started, faulty wiring, the investigators concluded, without much investigation. The building had burned to the ground in less than 2 hours. My father's remains were found near his workbench, along with all his designs, patents, and records, charred beyond recognition. Within weeks, Beatrice and Julian had moved into the mansion. They'd claimed they were here to help me, the traumatized young girl whose father had just died and whose mother had passed away 5 years earlier from cancer. They'd set up a trust for me, a pittance from my father's modest personal accounts. The real money, they explained, had been in the workshop, the business itself. And that business they'd built into an empire. Thorne Industries had become a multi-billion-dollar corporation under Julian's leadership. They'd created clean energy solutions, revolutionary prosthetics, and a line of luxury timepieces that my father would never have designed, everything bearing his name and genius, none of it actually his creation. That had been the cruelest part, watching the world praise my father for innovations he'd never made, while the man who'd actually birthed them was reduced to a cautionary tale about workplace safety. The only thing that had survived the fire was a grief, so complete it had become a second skin. I positioned the champagne tower and stepped back into the shadows, the way I'd learned to do. Invisibility was a skill I'd perfected. Stay quiet. Don't attract attention. Don't remind them that you exist. More sparkling water. A woman said, snapping her fingers at me without looking. I recognized her, a venture capitalist who'd been courting Julian for months. I nodded and turned toward the kitchen. That's when I stopped breathing. He was sitting at the VIP table, near the bay window, the one Julian always reserved for the most important guests. Tall, with the kind of bone structure that suggested his family had been wealthy for generations. Dark hair, with threads of silver at the temples. Steel gray eyes that seemed to assess the entire room as though calculating its worth and finding it wanting. But it wasn't his face that stopped my heart. It was his left hand, and the ring on his ring finger. Hammered gold, a band so intricate it looked like waves frozen mid-movement, set with a stone so black it seemed to absorb the light around it. Midnight onyx, the rarest variety, the kind my father had spent 6 months sourcing from a collector in Myanmar. My father had made that ring, with his own hands at his own workbench, for a commission so private he'd never told me who it was for. I'd only found out by accident, walking into his workshop one evening and finding him hunched over the jeweler's vise, his face creased with concentration as he worked the metal into submission. For a friend, he'd said when he caught me watching. Someone who understands that some things are worth doing perfectly, even if nobody ever knows your name. That ring had been on my father's bench the night of the fire. I knew this because it was the last thing I'd seen when the firefighters carried me out of the mansion, cradled in a blanket, my mother's screams echoing somewhere in the darkness. My mother, not Beatrice. My real mother, Catherine, who'd been in the house that night, visiting from the city for my father's birthday dinner. She died in that fire, along with my father. The investigators had ruled it a tragedy. I'd always known it was something else. The man with the ring lifted his glass of scotch, and the light caught the gold band, throwing tiny stars across the table. My feet moved before my mind could catch up. I crossed the ballroom like someone moving through a dream, the weight of crystal and grief and 10 years of unanswered questions pushing me forward. I'd trained myself never to speak directly to the guests. Invisibility required silence. But some things were larger than the careful rules I'd constructed for survival. The man was mid-sip when my voice found its way out of my throat. "Excuse me, sir," I said, and it came out as a whisper. "That ring, where did you get it?" He lowered his glass slowly, deliberately. The movement had the precision of someone used to being watched, used to controlling every gesture. When his eyes met mine, I felt the world shift on its axis. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice exactly what I would have expected, deep, authoritative, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The ring," I repeated, stronger now, "on your left hand. Where did you get it?" He studied me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "That," he said slowly, "is a very good question. Who are you?" Before I could answer, a force like gravity pulled at my arm. "Julian." His fingers dug into my bicep with a pressure that bordered on painful, his smile fixed in place like something he'd learned from a manual. "I'm so terribly sorry," he said to the man, laughing in that easy way that had made him a billionaire. "This is my niece, Ilera. She suffers from some mental health challenges. Sometimes she fixates on things that aren't real." The man's eyes didn't leave mine. If anything, they sharpened. "She doesn't look delusional," he said quietly. "She looks like she just saw a ghost." "Come with me," Julian said to me, his grip tightening. He was dragging me toward the door now, his smile never wavering. "It's getting late. Time for your medication." I looked back at the man one more time. He was standing now, setting his glass down with a deliberate slowness that suggested he was making a decision. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ilera Thorne," I said, and in that moment, watching his face go pale, watching him register something in his eyes that looked like recognition and grief, I understood that I was about to change everything. The private study was exactly as I remembered it leather-bound books lining mahogany shelves, a Persian rug that probably cost more than most people's homes, and the kind of silence that only inherited wealth could afford. Julian closed the door behind us and released my arm, stepping back to study me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Not anger, calculation. He was running numbers in his head, the way he did when he thought no one was watching. That was reckless, he said, finally moving toward the bar in the corner of the room. Silas Blackwell is not a man you speak to without permission. He's not a man you speak to at all, actually. He doesn't suffer fools, and he absolutely doesn't suffer questions about his personal possessions. Silas Blackwell. The name meant nothing to me, and everything. It activated something in my memory, a conversation I'd overheard between my parents years ago before the fire. A phone call my father had taken late at night, his voice tight with excitement. "You handled that beautifully," I said, and I heard the anger in my own voice. The gaslighting, the medication story. Very practiced. Julian turned to look at me, his glass half raised to his lips. He was a handsome man, I'd give him that. Silver-haired and distinguished, the kind of man who looked like he should be on the cover of a magazine about successful business owners. The kind of man you'd never suspect of murder. "Careful," he said softly. "You're forgetting your place." "I haven't forgotten anything," I replied. "That's the problem, isn't it? I remember everything about that night. The smell of metal and burning wood, the sound of your footsteps in the hallway, the way Mom screamed when you locked the workshop door." He didn't react. That was the thing about Julian. He had a face like marble. You could throw accusations at him, like stones, and they'd just bounce off. "Your mother died in a tragic fire," he said, his voice measured. "As did your father. It was an accident. The investigators confirmed it. And you, Ilera, have spent 10 years building a fantasy where you were somehow present at an event you were asleep for in the mansion nowhere near the workshop." He turned away from me, his posture relaxing slightly. "You've had a difficult life. That's not your fault. But your instability, that's exactly why you can't be having these outbursts at important galas. It undermines everything we've built, everything your father would have wanted for you." "Don't," I said, "don't tell me what my father would have wanted. You didn't know him." Julian smiled over his shoulder. "On the contrary, I knew Thomas very well, well enough to know he would have wanted his daughter to have a stable home, medication when necessary, a family who looked after her, which is exactly what we've provided. The problem with Julian was that he believed his own lies. You could see it in the way he'd constructed them, like architecture, each story supporting the next. Years of careful narratives, of doctors who'd never met me prescribing medications I never took, of a story so elegant and sad that the world had no reason to question it. The door opened without a knock. Beatrice swept into the room like she'd been summoned, though I hadn't heard any signal. She'd changed out of her evening wear into a negligee that probably cost more than my annual budget, the budget that came from a trust my father had left me, which they controlled completely. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice dripping with concern. She was good at this, the concerned relative routine. She'd had a decade to perfect it. Ilera had a moment with one of the guests. Julian explained, speaking about me as though I wasn't in the room. "I think it's time she retired for the evening. The stress of these events is becoming too much." "Of course," Beatrice said, moving toward me with outstretched arms like she was about to comfort a frightened child. "Come, dear, let's get you settled." I stepped away from her, toward the window. From here, I could see the workshop, or what remained of it, a rebuilt structure, supposedly for storage, though I'd never seen anything stored there. It was locked, always locked. "I need to speak to Silas Blackwell," I said quietly. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Absolutely not, Julian said, his voice dropping into a register I'd learned to fear. You are a guest in this house, Ilera, only because we choose to allow it. You will retire to your room. You will not attend any further social events. And you will certainly not be speaking to anyone about your delusions. They're not delusions, I said, turning to face him. I'm a daughter looking for the truth about my parents' death. Your parents died in an accident, Beatrice said, her voice sharp now, the mask slipping. And if you continue with this narrative, we'll have no choice but to have you committed. There are facilities, Ilera, very nice ones, where people like you, people with your condition, are cared for properly. There was the threat. It had been implicit for so long that hearing it stated plainly was almost a relief. Get out, I said. They exchanged a look, Julian and Beatrice, my aunt and uncle, the architects of the theft that had become my life. You need to think very carefully, Julian said, about what you're prepared to lose. You have a roof over your head. You have food. You have a family. Are you really prepared to throw that away for something that doesn't exist? But as he left the room, as Beatrice followed him with one last pointed look, I realized the answer was yes. I had to find Silas Blackwell. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my small room on the third floor, what had once been my father's library, and waited. I'd learned patience from necessity, the way prisoners learn it, the way ghosts learn it. At dawn, when the house was still dark, I made my decision. I couldn't leave the house. Not officially. Technically, I was still a minor according to the documents Julian controlled, though I'd turned 23 2 months ago, an event that had gone unmarked, unacknowledged. The legal paperwork was a labyrinth of trusts and conservatorship that kept me tethered to this place. But I could move through the servants' passages. I could access the library. And most importantly, I could use the ancient computer in what was once my father's office, a machine that had been overlooked during their takeover of the house. Finding Silas Blackwell was easier than I expected. He had a Wikipedia page, a company, an office building in Manhattan, just 3 hours away. What I didn't have was a way to contact him without going through official channels. And any request I made would be flagged, questioned, controlled. The solution came to me as I was arranging flowers in the dining room 2 days later. You're quite good at that, a voice said from the doorway. I froze mid-arrangement. It was Kelsey, still in her nightgown at 2 in the afternoon, which told me she'd been out most of the night. My cousin had developed what I could only describe as a sophisticated party habit. You should do it professionally, she continued, examining her nails with practiced disinterest. Instead of wasting your talents here. I didn't respond. Speaking to Kelsey was a trap. Anything I said to her would be reported back to her mother within the hour. I actually came to ask you something, she said, surprising me. She moved further into the room, closing the door behind her. There's a man. He's been calling the house, asking for you. Julian won't tell me what it's about, but he looked absolutely furious. I'm guessing it's the guy from the gala? The hot one? Silas something? My heart stopped. He called multiple times. Julian said you were unavailable, that you were unwell. But then this morning, he sent something to the house. It was addressed to you directly, which is why Julian couldn't intercept it. She pulled an envelope from her nightgown pocket. It was cream-colored, expensive, and sealed with black wax. I'm giving this to you because, contrary to what you might believe, I'm not entirely a monster. Also because watching Julian have an absolute meltdown is entertaining as fuck. I took the envelope with shaking hands. It was warm from being held against her skin. What does he want? I asked. Kelsey shrugged. He didn't say, but he sounded urgent. Honestly, I think he sounded scared. She turned toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I don't think you're crazy. I think Mom and Dad are. And I think whatever that is, she gestured to the envelope, might be important. Then she was gone. I opened the letter with a knife I stole from the kitchen. The handwriting was bold, masculine, and economical with words. Ilera, I've spent 10 years trying to reach your father. Today, I learned why I couldn't reach him. I don't know how much you know, but I know this. You should never have been alone. I'm remedying that. Come to the train station on 5th and Madison at 9 p.m. on Sunday. Bring nothing but yourself. I'll be waiting. S. Blackwell. P.S. Your father told me to find you if anything happened to him. He gave me a description. Dark eyes, strong hands, his stubbornness. He said, she'll look like she's looking for the truth. I saw you looking for the truth. The train station was nearly empty at 9 p.m. on a Sunday evening in November. I'd snuck out through the kitchen gardens. Using a path I'd discovered years ago that the renovated mansion had somehow missed, my heart was a rabbit in a cage, beating so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. I knew the risks, going with a stranger, leaving the house without permission, betraying the careful narrative that had become my identity. But my father's voice was in my head, the memory of it. She'll look like she's looking for the truth. He'd known. Somehow, he'd known that if anything happened, if Julian was successful, someone would need to see me. Really see me. Silas Blackwell stood on the platform like he'd been waiting for me my whole life. He was taller than I remembered, and older. There was something weathered about him, like someone who'd learned to carry heavy things. When he saw me, his entire body seemed to relax, tension draining from his shoulders. Ilera, he said, and he said my name like a prayer. How do you know me? I asked. Your father was my partner, he said, and my best friend. Come, we need to talk, and we cannot do it in this house. He took me to a penthouse overlooking the Hudson River. Not his office, his private space, the kind of sanctuary that people with real power created for themselves. We didn't speak until we were inside, until he'd poured himself a drink and looked at me with those gray eyes that seemed to contain decades of accumulated sorrow. Your father died in 2013, he said, not as a question, but not in the way you've been told. I know he didn't die in a fire. I said, I know someone locked the door. I know. You know the shape of the truth, Silas interrupted gently. But not the architecture. Sit. This is going to take a while. And so I listened as the man who claimed to be my father's closest friend told me a story that rewrote everything. In 1998, when they were both in their 30s, Thomas Thorne and Silas Blackwell had met at MIT. They'd recognized in each other a rare thing, brilliance that matched their own. Silas was an engineer, specifically interested in renewable energy. My father was an artist, an inventor, someone who could make the theoretical concrete. Together, they'd created something revolutionary. He called it the heartbeat, Silas told me, handing me a photograph. It showed my father in his workshop, standing beside a machine I'd never seen before. He looked younger, his face bright with accomplishment. A way to harness and store energy using principles based on natural rhythms. Cardiac rhythms, specifically. The human body runs on electrical impulses. Your father theorized that we could create systems that mimicked that efficiency. How? I asked. That's where your father's genius came in. The theoretical physics I could do, but making it elegant, making it beautiful, making it something that could actually function in the real world, that was Thomas. And by 2013, we were close. We had working prototypes. We were about to file the patent. Silas stood and walked to a painting on the wall. abstract, but somehow it reminded me of mechanical rhythms. Then your father met your mother. I looked up sharply. What does that have to do with? Everything, Silas said. Catherine was Beatrice's sister. Thomas didn't know. Beatrice kept it quiet because she was trying to trap him. She'd been after him since they met, but he wasn't interested. Then Catherine started dating him, and Beatrice realized she could use that to get close to him. She introduced herself as Catherine's sister. She wormed her way into his life. That's not. My parents loved each other. They did, Silas said softly. Catherine was innocent in this. She loved him genuinely, I think. But Beatrice? Beatrice was always after the money, after the power, and Julian was her partner in it. Silas set down his drink. Julian didn't have the same brilliance as your father, but he had something equally valuable, an absolute lack of conscience. He saw what your father was building, what the heartbeat represented, and he saw a way to take it, to become the genius, to rewrite history. But how would he? Carefully, Silas said. He started small, talking about business partnerships, about how your father could use a mentor, someone more experienced in the financial side of things. He was positioning himself. Slowly. And then, in December of 2013, everything accelerated. Silas pulled out a leather journal. Inside, the handwriting was unmistakably my father's. I recognized it immediately. Your father kept detailed records. Silas said, when he started to suspect that Julian was stealing his research, he began documenting it. Here. He pointed to an entry dated just days before the fire. Julian came to me today with documentation suggesting he's been pitching the heartbeat to investors. My work. My designs. He's claiming it's a collaborative effort, that he brought the financial expertise. I told him to stop. He smiled and said no. He said that Catherine's life, that your life, Ilara's life, might be in danger if I made a fuss. That people get hurt in fires all the time. Accidents happen. He was very clear about what he was threatening. The room spun. I couldn't breathe. He threatened to kill you, Silas said quietly. To kill your mother. To burn you all to make it look like an accident if your father didn't sign over rights to the heartbeat and agree to a new narrative. That Julian had been the genius all along. No, I whispered. That's not. The fire was investigated. The official report was falsified, Silas said. I've spent 10 years trying to prove it. Julian had connections. Men in the department. The fire was ruled accidental, and since all the evidence burned, no one could question it. He stood and walked to a safe built into the wall, disguised as a piece of art. From it, he withdrew something that made my breath catch. A ring, hammered gold, set with midnight onyx. This is the ring your father made for me, Silas said. In 1999, after we'd first succeeded in creating a working prototype, he said he wanted to commemorate the day that everything changed. He said that some things should be marked, remembered, made real. He turned it so the light caught the gold. And I saw that the inner band had an indentation almost invisible unless you were looking for it. When Julian threatened him, your father knew he needed insurance, Silas said. He couldn't go to the police. Julian had said that any official report might trigger the fire. So he created something only a person he trusted would have. Silas pressed the indentation, and a tiny compartment in the ring clicked open, revealing something I had to lean in close to see. A serial number. But more than that, a micro-engraving so small it was almost impossible to read. A key, Silas said, to a safety deposit box. A vault, actually, that your father set up under an alias, where he kept everything he needed to prove what Julian was doing, and where he left insurance. For you. He looked at me with eyes that held 10 years of waiting for this moment. He died protecting you. Ilara! Your mother too, when they wouldn't back down. When they insisted on going to the authorities despite the threats, Julian made good on his promise. He started the fire himself, locked them in. The official story, faulty wiring, an accident, was a mercy, a way to keep your mother's courage secret, to keep what really happened from destroying her memory. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, though I knew. It was written all over his face. Because I kept a copy of everything, Silas said. Documentation, plans, and because I've spent a decade trying to figure out who to trust with it. And today, a young woman with her father's stubbornness and her mother's courage walked up to a stranger at a party and asked about a ring. He handed it to me. The gold was still warm. Your father said if anything happened to him, I should find you. He said you'd be the one who could finish what they started, that you'd have his mind and her heart, and together those things could rebuild the world. I held the ring between my palms, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Something deeper. Resolution. What do I have to do? I asked. The vault was in Philadelphia, in a building so nondescript that you could walk past it 1,000 times and never see it. Silas had driven us there, using back roads and avoiding highways, moving with the precision of someone who'd been planning an escape route for 10 years. The ring worked. When I pressed the indentation into the lock, it read the biometric data embedded in the micro-engraving, a technology that was decades ahead of its time, something only my father could have created. And the door swung open. Inside was my father's ghost. Not literally. Literally, it was a climate-controlled storage unit filled with boxes, files, and in the center, a computer system that was ancient by modern standards, but somehow still functioning. He updated the security codes remotely, Silas explained, via a system he built into this ring. Every few years, he'd refresh the encryption, thinking ahead, hoping that one day you'd need this. He was always thinking ahead. The first box contained financial records, proof that Julian had been siphoning money from my father's research fund for years before the fire. The second contained design documents for the heartbeat, all dated and signed by Thomas Thorne, with detailed notes showing how Julian was systematically stealing the concepts and filing them under his own name. But the third box contained something that stopped us both cold. Video. Digital copies of security footage, all dated December 15th, 2013, all showing the moments leading up to the fire. In the first video, my parents were in the workshop. My father was demonstrating something to my mother, a prototype glowing with light, humming softly like something alive. She laughed, a sound that made my chest ache with loss I'd suppressed for a decade. Then Julian appeared at the door. I watched as he showed my father a document. I watched my father's face change, watched him refuse to sign. I watched my mother stand up, defiant, as Julian's expression turned cold. He pulled out a lighter. "This can be easy," he said, his voice so clear on the recording that it seemed impossible no one had heard it. "You sign. You claim you sold the technology to me out of kindness, and everyone walks away alive. Or you be a hero, and I burn you all." My father's voice was steady. "My daughter will know the truth." Julian smiled. "Your daughter will be too traumatized to matter. I'll make sure of that." He walked toward the workbench, toward something my father had kept in the back, a container of solvents. And as I watched, my hands clenched into fists, he began the fire. But then, instead of leaving, he did something I didn't expect. He locked the door from the outside, and he waited. In the video, I could hear my mother screaming, my father's voice, calling out that there had to be another way, the sound of them trying the door, trying windows. "Why?" I whispered. "Why did he lock the door?" "Insurance," Silas said, his jaw tight. He needed there to be no question that it was deliberate. He needed the locked door to be something the investigators couldn't explain away. something that would eventually, when the truth came out, prove murder beyond question. But the problem was the truth never came out. Julian had had the right connections, the right money, the right narrative ready to go. Silas clicked to the next file. It was more recent, dated just a week before the fire, but this was a video my father had recorded himself. He was sitting in the vault in this very room, and he was speaking directly to the camera, directly to me. "Hello, my darling girl," he said, and 10 years of pain collapsed in my chest. "If you're watching this, it means that my worst fears have come true. It means that Julian's threats were real and that I've made the choice to protect you the only way I know how." He looked older than I remembered, tired, but his eyes were bright. "I want you to know that this wasn't for nothing. The heartbeat isn't just a machine, Ilera. It's a philosophy. It's the belief that we can create power from the rhythm of life itself, that we can build things not by dominance, but by harmony. That was always what I was trying to do, not create something that conquered the world, but something that worked with it, something that was beautiful." He leaned forward, and I could see his hands, strong, precise, the hands that had forged the gold ring I was wearing. "I'm leaving you something, not the heartbeat itself. That's not enough. I'm leaving you the key to everything Julian won't want you to have. The proof, the documentation, everything." He smiled, and it was heartbreaking. "And I'm leaving you the choice. You can use this to destroy Julian and your Aunt Beatrice. You can expose them, prosecute them, take back what's yours. But you can also do something better. You can take what you learn from the heartbeat and you can really finish it. You can make it work. You can give the world what Julian and I were too small to truly give them." He reached toward the camera as if he could touch me across 10 years. "I am so sorry to leave you, my darling. I am so sorry to let you down by not being there to watch you grow. But I have every faith in who you'll become. You have your mother's courage and my stubbornness. That's a combination that can change the world." The video ended. I sat in silence in my father's vault, holding his ring, and I finally let myself cry. I spent 2 weeks planning. Silas wanted to go to the authorities immediately, wanted to contact federal agencies, and have Julian arrested by lunchtime. But I'd learned patience. I'd learned that sometimes the most elegant solutions took time. "He'll just claim deep fake," I said to Silas, as we sat in his penthouse reviewing the evidence. "He'll say the videos are fabricated, without physical evidence, without witnesses." "I'm a witness," Silas said. "And he'll say you're biased, that you've been trying to steal his company for a decade out of spite. He's already built that narrative." I looked at the calendar on the wall. "But he has a merger planned for next month. Isn't that right?" Silas had mentioned it in passing, a massive deal that was going to triple Thorn Industries' valuation. "How do you know about that?" "Because Kelsey mentioned it," I said. She overheard Julian on a call. "He's selling the heartbeat to Apex Innovations for $5 billion. He's using my father's death as a way to complete his deception." "Perfect," Silas said, understanding immediately. "Perfect." I agreed. The plan was simple. We had 2 weeks to become untraceable to the house. Silas hired a team, forensics experts, cybersecurity specialists, people who understood how to build an unassailable case. Meanwhile, I returned to the mansion. Kelsey saw me emerge from the kitchen gardens and didn't ask where I'd been. She was good at that, at understanding when not to push. She'd always had better survival instincts than Beatrice gave her credit for. "You're going to do something terrible to them," she said, stepping into the hallway where I stood dripping water from my jacket. "Yes," I said. "Good," she replied. "Can I watch?" I studied my cousin. She was the only real victim in this house besides myself. Raised to believe lies, turned into a tool, taught that cruelty was currency. Why would you help me? Because I'm tired of pretending to be happy. She said simply, because watching Dad and Mom lie every single day is exhausting. And because, despite everything, I think somewhere deep down I know that what they did to you was wrong. It was the closest to honesty I'd ever heard from her. I'm going to ask you to do one thing, I said. Before it all comes down, I'm going to ask you to visit me, to look confused and hurt, to make sure they know I'm still here. Can you do that? Yes, Kelsey said. And Alara, I'm sorry for everything. The merger gala was scheduled for November 30th. It was to be Julian's triumph, the moment when he'd complete his theft and legitimize it through a $5 billion transaction. The moment when my father's life work would be transformed into his legacy forever. I'd accepted an invitation to serve, per Julian's insistence that I maintain appropriate social distance. Silas had accepted an invitation as a member of the venture capital group that would be acquiring a stake in Apex Innovations. He was there as a rival, a competitor, a man interested in seeing what Julian had built. And I was there as the girl in the servant's uniform, invisible until the moment I chose to be seen. The ballroom was more crowded than it had been for the September Gala. These were the people who moved capital around the world, who created companies and destroyed them, who saw people as leverage. They stood in small clusters, drinking champagne, and making decisions that would reshape industries. Julian looked triumphant. He stood in the center of the room, like a man who'd just conquered something, his arm around Beatrice, who wore a dress that probably cost $500,000. Kelsey stood nearby, looking appropriately elegant and appropriately empty, the perfect socialite daughter. I positioned myself near the stage where Julian would give his speech. At 8 p.m., he would stand and announce the merger. He would talk about innovation and family legacy. He would claim that my father's life's work was his greatest honor. At 8:01 p.m., I was going to show the world something different. Silas caught my eye across the room. Just a glance. Just an acknowledgement. We were about to destroy everything he'd built. And that was the point. At 7:55 p.m., I walked to a server and handed him a flash drive. It needs to go to the AV system, I said quietly. When the CEO takes the stage, you're going to patch this into the big screens. Can you do that? The server, an older man named Marcus, who'd always been kind to me, looked at the drive, and then at me. He'd seen me treated as less than furniture for 10 years. He'd watched, silently, like most people who witness cruelty and feel powerless to stop it. What is this? He asked. The truth, I said. He nodded, and he was moving, disappearing into the technical booth. I saw him hook up the drive, saw him run tests, saw him signal to me with a small thumbs up. Julian took the stage at 8 p.m. exactly. He was glowing with the pleasure of his own success. He talked about my father as though he'd known him, as though they'd been true partners. He wept crocodile tears about the tragedy of the fire, about how losing Thomas had only strengthened his resolve to complete what Thomas had started. And then, while the cameras rolled and the room listened rapt, I pressed a button on the phone Silas had given me. And my father spoke. The screens behind Julian erupted with his face. Thomas Thorne, alive, speaking about the heartbeat, about the principles behind it, about how it was meant to revolutionize the world. The room went absolutely silent. But it was the second video that broke him. It was the security footage. It was the locked door. It was Julian's voice, clear and unmistakable, telling my father that he would burn them if they didn't sign. It was my mother's scream. It was the fire. Julian's face turned the color of old bone. He looked toward the screens as though they might disappear if he stared hard enough, as though this might all be some kind of elaborate illusion. Security, he screamed. Turn it off. That's a deep fake, a fabrication. but the room was already mobilizing. Silas had arranged this carefully. There were federal agents in the crowd, business associates who'd been briefed, journalists who had front-row seats to what was happening. Beatrice tried to run, but Silas's security team was already at the exits. Julian fell to his knees on the stage, his hands shaking as the video continued to play. My mother's voice, calling out for help. My father's voice, steady even as the fire consumed him, saying, "The truth will set her free." "It's a lie," Julian was saying. "It's all a lie. Alara, if you're here, I know you're here. She's insane. She's been saying these things for 10 years. And that's when I stepped out of the shadows. I wasn't wearing my uniform anymore. I was wearing a dress the color of midnight, and around my neck, on a silver chain, hung the ring my father had forged. The ring that had opened his vault. The ring that had changed everything. The room fell absolutely silent. I walked to the stage, not running, not angry, moving with the kind of certainty that only comes when you finally understand your own worth. The cameras were on me, and I didn't look away. "My name is Alara Thorne," I said, and my voice was steady and strong. "I am the daughter of Thomas Thorne and Catherine Thorne. I am the only person in this room who was there the night this man killed my parents." Julian made a sound like something breaking. "You weren't there," he whispered. "You were asleep. You couldn't have." "I wasn't asleep," I said quietly. I was 14 years old, and I was hiding in the workshop because I loved my parents and I wanted to see my father's great work. I watched you light the fire. I watched you lock the door. And I would have died in that fire too if I hadn't been small enough to fit through a window that you missed. The room was deathly silent. For 10 years, you've told the world that you built the heartbeat. For 10 years, you've used my father's name while erasing his work, his vision, his purpose. Today, that ends. Beatrice had gone completely white. Kelsey was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The police are outside," I continued. "They have copies of everything you see on these screens, plus the evidence from my father's vault. Video, documentation, financial records. Everything Julian stole, everything Beatrice helped him steal." Julian stood up. For a moment, I thought he might try to run. Instead, he looked at me with an expression of such pure hatred that it was almost transcendent. "You ruined everything," he said. "No," I replied. "I saved it." The trial lasted 6 weeks. It was a national sensation. A billionaire brought down by his own victim, evidence that couldn't be denied, a conspiracy so elaborate that people could barely wrap their minds around it. Beatrice broke almost immediately. Facing life imprisonment, she turned state's evidence, detailing every falsified medical record, every bribed official, every deliberate lie designed to keep me sedated and compliant. She wept and begged for mercy, and the judge sentenced her to 30 years. Julian fought. He maintained his innocence, insisted the videos were deep fakes, claimed that I was a disturbed young woman seeking revenge for imagined slights. But the evidence was too overwhelming, too coordinated, too perfectly damning. Video evidence of the fire, combined with the detailed documentation in my father's vault, created a narrative that no amount of legal maneuvering could escape. He was sentenced to life without parole. Kelsey, who'd had no knowledge of the deeper crimes, faced a choice. She could stay in Bentonville, could try to rehabilitate her image, could claim that she'd been a victim of her mother's manipulation. Instead, she did something unexpected. She disappeared. Not vanished. I found out later that she'd moved to a small town in Oregon, gotten a job at a coffee shop, and started a quiet life. She sent me a note once, just once. "I'm sorry for who I was. I hope I can become someone better." I never replied, but I didn't throw the letter away either. The Thorne Industries building, which had been built on the foundation of my father's stolen work, was seized by the government, Silas, and I went through the legal processes to retrieve everything that was legitimately my father's creation, everything that was stolen. It took months and teams of lawyers, but eventually the court agreed that the heartbeat technology belonged to the Thorne estate, which meant it belonged to me. What do you want to do with it? Silas asked me 3 months after Julian's conviction. We were standing in the workshop, the original workshop, which I'd had rebuilt scrap by scrap, following my father's original designs. You could patent it. You could sell it for billions. You could license it. You could do anything. I looked around the workshop at the machines my father had designed, the tools he'd used, the space where his genius had flourished. And I thought about the last thing he'd said in that final video. I want you to do something better. I want to launch it, I said. As a nonprofit, I want it to be available to any community, any government, any group that needs clean energy. I want to make it free. Silas stared at me. Do you have any idea what you're giving up? That technology is worth. I know what it's worth, I said. That's exactly why I can't sell it. It's too important. And my father spent his entire life building things to help people, not to help himself. I'm not going to dishonor his memory by doing anything else. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. Your father would be so proud, he said. I know, I replied. He told me so. The Heartbeat Initiative launched 6 months later. Silas joined me as co-founder, bringing his engineering expertise and his connections. We licensed the technology to countries struggling with energy poverty. We taught engineers how to build the systems. We created a foundation dedicated to your father's vision. The Thorne Mansion became the headquarters, but I didn't live there. Instead, I turned it into a sanctuary, a place for children who'd lost their parents, who needed a home that wasn't a cage, a place where kids could come and be healed the way I was never healed. And I did something else. I renamed the company, Thorne and Blackwell Industries, a partnership at last between my father and the man who'd waited 10 years for the truth to be revealed. A year after Julian's conviction, I stood on the roof of the new Heartbeat headquarters, a building powered entirely by the technology my father had created. The city glowed beneath me, powered by the rhythm of clean energy, powered by the dream of a man who died believing in a better world. He would have loved this, Silas said, coming to stand beside me. He'd aged in the aftermath of the trial, but he'd also healed. There was peace in his face now, the kind that only comes when you've finally laid a burden down. I know, I said. He showed me how much in that final video. I was wearing my father's watch on one wrist and his ring on the other. The watch kept perfect time. The ring opened doors. What about Julian? Silas asked. Do you ever think about him? Every day, I said, but not the way you're asking. I don't hate him anymore. I understand him. He was a small man who wanted to be bigger, and he destroyed beautiful things to try to make himself large. That's its own kind of prison. Silas nodded slowly. And your Aunt Beatrice? I don't think about her at all. I replied. She made her choice. Now she has to live with it. 2 years after the Heartbeat Initiative launched, I received a visitor at the foundation. She was in her early 20s, thin-faced, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from a lifetime of privilege crumbling into nothing. It took me a moment to recognize her. Kelsey. She'd aged in the time since I'd seen her at the trial. She was wearing ordinary clothes, cheap ones worn at the edges. Her hair, once meticulously styled, hung in a simple braid. But her eyes were clear, and they held something they'd never held before, genuine remorse. I know you probably don't want to see me, she said, standing in the doorway of my office. I know I don't deserve your time, but I had to come to tell you that I'm sorry and to thank you. I gestured for her to sit. Thank me for what? For destroying the life they'd built for me, she said. I spent 2 years after the trial pretending to be important, pretending to be someone, and it was the worst 2 years of my life. Then I came here. You came to the Heartbeat Foundation? I applied for a job, she said, as a maintenance worker. Obviously, I didn't put my real name. I was too ashamed. But your HR department saw through it. They sat me down, and they asked me if I wanted to come work here, if I wanted to try to understand what I'd been a part of. I hadn't known about this. I made a mental note to talk to our HR director. So I've been working here for 3 months, Kelsey continued, and I've been watching this place function, watching these communities get power, watching children come here to be healed. And I finally understand what Dad was stealing when he stole the heartbeat. He was stealing the chance for people to matter, for the world to be better. She looked at me directly, and there were tears in her eyes. I can't undo what I was. I can't take back 10 years of cruelty, but I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be someone worth knowing. And I thought I should ask your permission to do that here. I studied my cousin. The girl who'd called me a parasite had become someone else. The process of becoming that someone else had been clearly painful. What's your real name? I asked. Kelly, she said. Kelly Thorne. I'm taking back our family name, but as a reminder of who not to be. I smiled, and it was genuine. Welcome to the Heartbeat Initiative, Kelly. I stood in my father's workshop one final time, the day before the official opening of our second Global Heartbeat Center in Kenya. The space was exactly as he'd left it, preserved like a shrine. But it wasn't a place of death. It was a place of legacy. I held the onyx ring up to the light, and it caught the sun, throwing patterns of shadow and brilliance across my palm. Inside, the micro-engraving was invisible unless you knew to look for it. But it was still there, the serial number, the key, the proof that my father had loved me enough to plan for a future where he wasn't present. Thank you, I said to the empty workshop, for believing in me before I believed in myself. The factory bells rang out across the city, the sound of the heartbeat system powering the world, the rhythm of life itself transformed into energy. And I realized that my father's greatest invention wasn't a machine. It was a legacy. It was the proof that love, when poured into work, becomes immortal. I walked out of the workshop for the last time and closed the door softly behind me. The future was waiting, and my heartbeat, strong, steady, alive, was keeping time with it. They say that the greatest revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building something so beautiful that they can never again claim to have created it. Julian thought he could steal a machine. He didn't realize he was trying to steal a heart, my father's heart, which lived on in every innovation, every child helped, every community powered by clean energy. I wasn't the ghost anymore. I was the flame. And I was just getting started,